So I'm talking about comprehensive assessment following this COVID-19 quarantine period. So as we all come kind of back to school and we're looking at that comprehensive piece, I just need you to know really quickly that I don't have any relevant financial or any non-financial relationships with any products that I'm sharing. I didn't develop any of this. I don't get any money for any of this. I'm not affiliated with the testing companies. At the end of the day, I work at Lincoln Intermediate Unit number 12. We are the York County, Adams County, like Gettysburg and Chambersburg area. I'm a mom of 3 kids. I have a lot of staff that I work with. I supervise the speech and language department down here, as well as the deaf and hard of hearing department. And so I can date myself a little bit. Maybe some of you can relate that I got my undergraduate degree from Kutztown University, where sad to say they no longer have a speech and language program, but I also then got my master's degree from down at Towson. So any Kutztown alums or Towson alums out there, like little woot woot shout out for us. All right. As I looked at this topic today, and we're talking about comprehensive assessment, one of the things that I encourage the SLPs and the other service providers that I supervise here to consider is stick to those foundational principles that we always have, even if our situation now isn't exactly the same. And so I really stick with that 2-prong approach to eligibility for us, right? IDEA calls us to have that 2-pronged approach. So one of those prongs means that we need to find a disability in one of these 13 areas. I listed them out here for us. If most of you are SLPs like me, most of the time our disability category that we're trying to determine eligibility for is speech and language impairment. Sometimes we fit into other areas, as we all know, but mostly that's our eligibility direction. But we also have that whole second prong, which means that there also has to be an adverse effect on an educational performance. Note, educational performance could be either that academic performance or a functional performance as a direct result of the previous disability that we just talked about. So when we stick with that foundational principles, I think of it like this: our approach to assessment right now in this crazy environment is exactly the same as it was before. Only there's some tweaks we're going to have to make along the way to get this met. So at the end of the day, I'm going into an evaluation and an assessment thinking, does this student need specially designed instruction? And so right there, like I know, every word matters. And in this case, the word is need. I'm looking at my evaluations to say, does the student not benefit from specially designed instruction, but do they need specially designed instruction in order to be successful with their educational programming? Again, either academic or functional programming. So as long as we stay true to this, we're going to stay true to our standards. I think that is more important now than it ever really has been for us. Because I think right now we're falling into a trap of students who may not have had much interaction. They may not have had much service. They may not have had much support from March until they started school this year. And depending on their situation, they may not have much support or interaction now. And yet here we are trying to say whether or not they have a speech and language impairment. So we're going to stick to these as our foundational skills and foundational practices. And then as we continue through thinking, what does the comprehensive evaluation really mean? So when we start, one of the things I really hit hard for our service providers here at IU12 is that academics come first. We really try to separate that medical model of evaluation with the school-based model of evaluation. And so academics come first. And what that really means is I need to get related service, or even if I'm not the related service, but our people to do observations in that school setting. because at the end of the day, especially now, I need to know if this is having an adverse effect on their educational performance. And one of the things that we're seeing happening now is that student discussion, students' amount of talking in class has drastically decreased. And so there are some students, especially in our secondary, but as early as 3rd and 4th grade, who do little talking all day. And so it will be very difficult to make the claim that they need to get direct service if I don't do that observation. So there are many ways to get what you need if you know a student needs service, but if you don't have the data from your observation in that school setting, there's going to be not enough to support your case. One of the things I encourage everyone to look for when they're out in those school observations is exactly how many opportunities do the students have to even attempt at volunteering an oral answer? Or how many attempts do they have to provide a written answer? How much is just input that they're gathering from a teacher or another source, maybe the iPad? How many opportunities were taken, and then how many times did they actually get to respond? These practices aren't different than the practices I encourage when schools were totally normal and we had, kids talking all over the place. But now we have to be more careful about how to get that observation in. Some of our students are fully virtual, and so that observation might mean that I'm going to join the Zoom session that the teacher has with the student. For us down here at IU12, we have a lot of students that are fully cyber, which means they don't have a live instruction period. All of their instruction is provided through a computer, through leveled scaffolding materials. And so those students don't even have a live instructor talking to them and then the student talking back. They're only reading, answering, and submitting. And so for those students, one of the things we've really been working on is connecting with a case manager from the district's end. Here at IU12, I do a lot of district-based SLP services. And so we're not district employees, we are service providers in a district. And so we're trying to connect with someone in that district who can help us be that liaison to have a live interaction with the student, maybe once a month or maybe twice a month, to make sure that they get a face-to-face live interaction. We can also participate as an observation in that. I'm also really pushing this academic part to get plenty of grades, plenty of samples of classwork, plenty of spelling performance and writing pieces and copies of the text-dependent analysis. I think in this time when we're maybe not as in the classroom as we once were, getting that information is more difficult, but I think it's equally valuable to continue to gather that information. The other thing that's different this time, but wasn't less important before, just as different now, is the attendance component. I think what we need to do is make sure we know that the student had the opportunity to have live face-to-face instruction in the school building 1 day a week, 2 days a week. What's their schedule? I think that goes into our assessment. Whereas before maybe we were just tracking how many absences they have. Now we're tracking and considering their actual participation and their type of attendance. I linked up a sample Google form. I'm gonna click on it now, see if it can hop me to it. One of the ways that we're starting to get some teacher input is through the use of the Google Forms. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with using Google Forms or if you've even used them in this way. The form for the teacher themselves is very easy. Here's my sample where they just put in the student name, teacher name. You can just, Iron Man, the teacher's name is the Hulk. And then I made, the number scale so the teachers can just go through and easily, give you a nice, quick, clear, objective rating on all the skills that you might think are really important and worth getting data on. Gives a couple of open-ended. In no way am I saying that this form is the form to use. This is just an example of what you might get or what you might use. After the teachers submit this form, so I included a whole bunch of questions, and hopefully if your link is active and you can see it, then you'll be able to preview all those questions that I included. They would hit submit. Those then go to it'll build into this large spreadsheet. It's a little bit difficult to read on my end of things as the person providing that, collecting that data, but I'm willing to tolerate me having to sort through the boxes of the spreadsheet to get the data I need if it's going to help me get teacher input a little bit more quickly. Because I think one of the things that is part of any comprehensive evaluation is getting some of that input from all the stakeholders, not just the regular education teacher. Because I know that you've had, like me, plenty of experience where the regular ed teacher might have the student for a smaller period of time than others, just because of the nature of going out for reading 3 times a week for 60 minutes each time, or going to ELL services, or working with the school counselor a lot. I think there are regular ed folks in our buildings that we sometimes get verbal kind of a touch base information from, but that we really need some hard data from. And those Google Forms make a nice, easy way to do that. I think there's also a huge component of this academic school-based SLP evaluation model that requires this data, and for us to kind of look at it. I can't stress enough that last piece on this slide where that networking and getting this data from the people who have it is a huge task, but so valuable. Networking with those reading specialists, intervention, school counselors, those folks really bring the knowledge of what the numbers for this data means. A lot of schools down here have a student information system. Maybe you do too, like Sapphire, Skyward, Infinite Campus, those kinds of things. And that has all the numbers I really need. If I have access to that, I have access to my students' data. But no matter how long I've been working with students, I don't know if the DIBELS at a score of 30 is any good for my particular student. I don't know if a DRA 16 is where he's supposed to be. I need to get a little interpretation from my other specialists at the school, and that's going to be a critical piece in this evaluation. The big theme for my presentation today is that I'm pushing us away from a single silo. I did my standardized test and I'm ready for either eligibility or dismissal. And I've now become just one piece of the puzzle, and all these other factors come into play. And so how do we get those other factors, and how do we find the time to do it? I mean, it's time intensive, it's labor intensive, and it would be much easier if I could just pound out a standardized test and say you're in or out. But that isn't how this works in this setting, and networking and collaboration are the ways to get there. So when I look at specifically our speech and language assessment portion, the things that we're most used to using, or at least I was most used to using, were our norm referenced standardized tests, right? There's a lot of tests out there. I'm not even going to mention any of them today. Some of them I really love. Some of them, I don't. So what the problem I found with sticking with just that standardized tests, even the ones I love, they don't give that full picture of what the student is able to do in the classroom. They give me a great picture of specific skills. They might, if I've given the right test, give me a great idea of what targets and goals I need to work on, but it doesn't give me a full picture of what the student can do. Also, some of those, the one I love, you can't administer it in 20 minutes. I mean, it's going to take, depending on your kid, 5 right, 1, or 5 wrong, 1 right makes a time intensive, test. So this is the situation following COVID where we have no spare time. Every minute counted before, don't get me wrong, but right now, every minute counts. And so I really ask everyone now to weigh the benefit of giving the standardized assessment that's not going to give you every ounce of information you need versus doing it because you always have. So That's what we're used to. And some of you may be in a situation where your district is asking you to do a standardized test for everyone, no matter what, and you have to do it. And by all means, then you have to do it. But I'm proposing that that is one piece, again, one piece of this giant puzzle, and it doesn't have to be the piece that we hang our hat on. Rather, I think there are speech and language probes that give us just lots and lots of clinical data that may or may not have norms associated with it, but that we can use to show the disability and also the need for specially designed instruction in the educational setting. One of those things that I found that to be a useful tool is this intelligibility and context scales. This is a, can show it to you quickly if you're not already looking at it. And if you are, that is also great. This is out of Australia, and it is a, I'm just gonna click on this link here, see if it pops open for you. This is a rating scale, a 5.7 question rating scale. I'm gonna scroll all the way down to see if it gives me a copy of it at the end. There it is. So there's 7 total questions, there's 5 points on the question, and it gives families and parents or teachers or bus drivers, it gives you a measure for intelligibility. It is not rocket science, but it is powerful and effective to show what students can do across different settings. The nice part about this little quick rating scale is that there are a little bit of norms associated with it. They're included in this free download. And then there is also, they've translated this form scale into 20 different languages. So when you get those move-ins from who knows where, if we put that in the chat, you'd blow up all the different countries you got kids moved in from. But there are 20 different languages that this scale has been translated into. So you can get a sense from your multilingual families of, are they unintelligible in English or also in their native language? So that's a really nice little measure. Also, we have, if you haven't been to a conference or workshop with Lynn Williams, I mean, I have no relationship with her, but I've listened to her twice, and every time I've found such value in what she offers us as a field in reconsidering speech sound disorders. And so she's really a huge developer and proponent of the systematic phonological analysis of child speech, the SPACS approach. I'm not going to click on that one. It takes you to a article that then does talk more and more about it, but it really takes a look at analyzing the errors that kids make. And we don't need the Goldman Fristo to tell us the errors kids make, right? I can get a language sample, I can get a single word list going, I can choose the targets myself, then I can do this analysis that Lynn Williams proposes through SPACS to show where they're making the errors in place. It compares the errors they're making in place, manner, and voice, and then guides you to choose your targets based on the maximal differences in the types of errors. I mean, it is just, in my opinion, again, showing my age, where all I was educated in was Van Riper's approach to articulation. This, for me, revolutionizes how we approach speech sound disorders, and using that as our eligibility criteria for enrollment in our services would be in some ways game changing for us as SLPs working on articulation. When I look at language, I think too that there are times when the teachers will report to us that students have significant trouble getting the words out, right? Whatever that means. So as we tease this out, we find out, oh, they're really having language problems. If it is not a clear-cut grammar issue, but is something else, how are we going to find out, tease out what that is? We don't have a lot of standardized measures that get into overlapping language difficulties. And so this SLAM, again, when I first learned about SLAM, it was only the subway picture and that was all you had. So I'll try to show that to you. they've come such a long way now, but what it is, I'll start with the subway picture. Oh, I lost it. There it is. The subway picture is a picture with a couple of questions attached to it that is simply used to elicit language from students. And it's not much of a stimulus material, but it is really powerful and effective. It's things like, what happened? Has this ever happened to you? The downloads here you can see are in a couple different translations. But when I download this one, let me see if it'll pop up. Great. I can share out, and I hope you're noticing that as I'm sharing this with you virtually, these are also tools that if you would have students who are still virtual with you, or even if they're not, and you just don't like paper materials, you could just use these with any student. So that you share the picture and show them, and then it comes with these pictures, you know, what happened, and then it gives you tips. You might need to give some support because, you know, they might not know about subways or trains or something like that. How did it happen? Did it happen to you? If no, then I tell them a little narrative about getting stuck or something like that. And then sometimes, you know, I'm hoping the student can make a self-reflection on that and then tell me something of their own. And then what would you do if this was you, right? This was the only picture they had when I first learned about SLAM. Now they have so many more. Oh gosh, I think I lost it there. Sorry about that. If you're feeling stressed about my clicking, I'm sorry. Let me just wait for it to catch up. Oh, that's still a subway picture. Going back one more. Now they have a lot of stories. And so I'm hoping you can see right here where there's 6. There's a set of 6. Here's a set of 7. And then what what students have to do is put them in order non-verbally, and then they go through and retell the story. And then there are also some questions about that afterwards. And I think that just gives us, because we know so much about language and grammar and context and inference and problem solving and all of the areas that we're skilled in, we are able to take what the students produce through the use of these tools and develop an appropriate diagnosis and then goals and a treatment plan based on this data. So those are the SLAM cards. Let me keep going. Importantly though, I mean, I did just hit us hard with articulation and language, because for me, in the populations that I'm in, that's where we hit most of our evaluations. I'm not going to concentrate too much on when we get evaluations in our low incidence populations like multidisability support, autism, even deaf and hard of hearing. I'm the supervisor of that, but I'm not exactly talking about those evaluations today. Today, I'm just hitting the bulk of like all those PTEs or PTREs, depending, that we get that kind of concentrate on articulation and language. But I cannot forget to comment on all of our areas. Even if all I can say is voice is within normal limits or voice is appropriate, feeding and swallowing skills don't seem to be a concern at this time. One of the things I see as a supervisor down here is that a student will come to school age programming from early intervention preschool with goals for articulation. But by 2nd grade, they've mastered the articulation. A danger that we run into down here is assessment for dismissal, where we've looked at the goals, we've looked at the past history, we assess for articulation, we dismiss, only to nearly immediately in 3rd grade discover that, ooh, his language skills weren't up to par. And when we look back, the history maybe kind of had slight indicators that language was a concern, but it was never as much of a concern as articulation. And so it never really fully got addressed. And so I continue to push this idea of if you're dismissing from special education where speech was the only service on the IEP, then we need to be sure to be able to defend why all of the speech areas are not eligible for special education or specially designed instruction. So that's where those speech probes really come into play. I can have a student go through one of those SLAM cards. I can get some data. I don't need a standardized test, but now I have solid data on language to defend if the student were to have difficulties in the classroom later. So comment on all of the areas. But don't forget to comment on, I feel worried that the more I talk about comprehensive assessment, your hearts are going to start to feel like, oh my gosh. But at the same time, I put such value in that evaluation report for eligibility, as well as for dismissal in my supervision here at IU12. Those two documents are such important documents that it is worth the time that you might need to get all of these things, to network with the right appropriate folks and to get the data you need for all these areas. So take the time to make the report worthwhile. And don't forget to comment on student behavior. I think one of the pitfalls that speech runs into is that sometimes behavior is related to speech production or unintelligibility, but sometimes it's separate. We can usually intuitively tease that out. And in our speech sessions, we don't often have behavior concerns. In the classroom, they have a much harder time teasing out if it's communication-based or task-based or whatever function of the behavior is occurring in the classroom. But we have such an analytical way about us that if a student is having behavior, we have to make some comments about that. If the student is not having behavior, we have to make some comments about that too, so that someone later down the line would be able to look back and say, oh, look, they have speech services and they weren't having behaviors then, but they are now. So just documentation. A comment on the vision and hearing thing. Sometimes we do forget to tend to consider some of these things, and I'm just really pushing to remind you that it all goes together. This comprehensive assessment is not just us doing the test and moving on. It's all of this together working to find out what the diagnosis and then the plan is going to be. More and more, we have students who this social history or specific known trauma is a part of this evaluation. You know, if we are only in a building or a district, like maybe one day a week, or maybe you only have one student in that building, this is the kind of data that can be really difficult to find, which again, I can't stress enough that networking with the folks in the building, in the district, makes such a difference. I'm not saying to lay out what the trauma was, right? I do have standards. And I'm saying if there has been trauma, we need to have a way of putting something like that into the document so that that's a trigger for someone if behaviors start arising and it turns out it might be related. Cultural information, again, can be really difficult to find. One of the things I worry about people assuming is I worry that they assume that if a parent speaks a foreign language, that is the student's first language as well. And so I really keep pushing SLPs to look at that home language survey. Every district in Pennsylvania, upon enrollment, has a family fill out the home language survey. And so find out what that is, read it for yourself, talk to those people who registered the student to find out for sure. And what I've also learned with dual language families is that sometimes they think that we want them to put English as the home language for the student, but convincing them that it doesn't matter what they put, we just want to know what is the home language, the first language of the student coming in. This is one I see a tendency to forget to include talking about adaptive behaviors for our regular ed, our TIC kids, but it is worth commenting on that those adaptive behaviors are typical for that grade. Or, turns out he visits the nurse 2 times a week to change his clothes because of bathrooming, right? Those are indicators of bigger things later on that I think we have the responsibility to include when appropriate. And I think sometimes they're just not included for us because we're not in a building enough to find that stuff out. So again, networking, building relationships, finding out, teaming with others, and getting this information is time consuming, labor intensive, and increasingly more valuable. And I also want to put a plug in. It doesn't happen a lot, at least down here, where you have a student who's 14 and up, but his speech is the only special education service that they get. If they do, you've got to get something in there from their interests, their preference, and their abilities related to post-secondary employment. That could be a whole nother thing, but I'm not going into it more. And this is where you're all like, wait a second, did I forget there's a national pandemic happening, worldwide really pandemic? Like how in the world are we supposed to do all of this? I can't even get students like in the building. So I'm still pushing, down here at least, I'm still pushing to see students face to face and keep everyone as safe as possible. And so here's a bunch of just tips that we're sort of using down here. I got plenty of people who are doing assessments where they have a plexiglass barrier between them and the student. They're all at like one table, like in many of your speech rooms, you have a table, God willing, you have speech rooms, and you have a barrier, the plexiglass barrier. Depending on the age of your student and your just material supply, you might have 2 stimulus manuals, and you might feel comfortable having the student have their own manual and flip their own pages. That's a solid maybe. If you don't, sometimes we've had a lot of folks using those finger pointers that I put on the presentation. And so instead of having all the students touching the stimulus manual, because it turns out you can't wipe them down with Clorox wipes like regularly, or they just don't hold up. So they can use the finger pointers. So other things that we've sort of learned, and I've learned through my involvement with deaf and hard of hearing, is that wearing the cotton mask does reduce the visibility of your face, but the sound quality for students is better than the sound quality if you have a shield. I do support safety more than anything. So I try to keep everyone masked or shielded. Sometimes people feel the need to have both, but I do promote that type of safety. However, sometimes you have to see the face. I mean, these are all so student specific. You have to know what is right for your student. For me, if the student doesn't have to see my face, I end up wearing, sorry, I'm gonna step away for just 1 second to get mine. I encourage them to wear a cotton face mask where now the sound quality, it's a little bit muffled, but overall about the same. I have some staff who use the clear, and they wear this, and we have some for the students. You can see it fogging up already, but I also didn't use the dish soap and then like make the buffer of the dish soap to clear mine off. These are just my samples, but I would have one for me and one for the student. I have the other shields, like this, where I will have, again, one for me, one for the student, but you can already hear how the sound quality is different and can be a barrier. If needed, if you're getting something in specific for your assessment, which I would have to ask what, it would be the special case where I think this would be needed, where I might have to take off my mask and the student would have to take off their mask for me to be able to see the right thing. I think they could probably compromise auditory for visual to see, and if I'm getting a stimulability, so I could give them a good strong model, and they may need to take off theirs if I need to see something in particular with alignment or oral motor functioning or something like that. If you find that you need to have a lot of exposure face-to-face, you might want to consider breaking up your testing into smaller increments of time so that you can either wipe things down, air out the room, things like that. And then one of the handouts, I'm not going to pull it up, but I just want you to know I did get permission from the creator to share it, is a checklist from the National Association of School Psychologists regarding evaluations. It's kind of like a see if you have this. School psychologists are under a lot more rigid and stringent telepractice requirements, but I still felt like that checklist was a good tool that maybe you would want to use or share with your school psychologists. The thing I would want to encourage everyone to do is in the evaluation report section that says the extent to which the assessment varies from standardized conditions, write something. I don't want to give you something to write because I don't know what you did, but you know what you did. And it doesn't mean that we can't count your results at all. We just want to know that I said everything with a mask covering my face, like my face was not exposed at any point, or I had a barrier in between us, and we just want to know. So list those things in that area. And then my last little bit here is that what if the student can't come in for an evaluation and you have to do something virtually? I mean, Pearson does have a couple of computer-based assessments that you'd be able to have the stimulus manuals right here on your computer, kind of like I'm sharing this presentation. But I think using a document camera to present the stimulus book can also work for you. One of the things, and I said use the webcam as the last resort. Like I'm really reluctant to say, oh, I'm not even sure if I have one down here, but let's just say that this word power manual is the stimulus manual. Like I'm reluctant to have you like hold up stuff like this to do your assessment. I'd rather see if you can get a document camera or even an iPad on a stand. That iPad or document, that if you do an iPad, you would log in to Zoom or Google Meet from a second account. So then there would really be 3 participants in the meeting. One is you live, one is the student live, and one is logging in just as the camera for the manual. So then you'll have that manual, you can put it into presentation mode, and then we'd be able to still see me, the student, and the manual all as one thing. There are some cases when you can modify the stimulus book to take it apart and make copies as PDF, but you need to check with the publisher and they would take it on a case-by-case basis. I'm not sure that a worldwide pandemic would allow all the publishers to just kind of agree to that. So I think your best approach is that document camera or iPad on a stand. But what I'm doing here I live, we are right on the Maryland line. We get just bonkers amount of students moving from Maryland to Pennsylvania. And so we get a ton of permissions to evaluate. And so one of the things we really consider is, has there been an evaluation done before that I would consider valid and reliable? Sometimes it just doesn't match. I get an evaluation in, we look at it and it's like, oh, I can't use that. So then we do our own. But sometimes we get an evaluation in from either an outpatient rehab or hospital or residential placement or who knows. And that evaluation seems totally great, ready to be used. And so we report that according to this assessment done on this by this place, the student was found to have a diagnosis of speech and language impairment, standard score this, blah, blah, blah. We use that as part of our assessment, followed up with some other tools. I'm going to hit really quickly on these 4 tools that I, again, have no ownership of or any relationship to. Again, I just want to point out this SLAM, that language assessment measures, because what they ended up doing for our virtual kids is just so cool. I cannot even stand it. So this is one about baseball troubles, and it's made for the virtual land. So you can see when I hover over number 1, I get the pointer. But number 2, 3, like these are not active. Number 1 is the active link. What we're gonna do is you're gonna ask students to put a series of picture cards in order. So right now, we're gonna decide which one goes in number 1. I click it, click. And now here are my choices. I need to look at these 7 choices and decide by clicking which one is the first one. Now in Zoom, I have the ability to give the student remote access. And so the student could click it themselves. The problem with that is that they could secretly be testing all of the ones except the right one, and you don't know. So if I give them remote access to click and have the power, that's cool, but I don't know when they've gotten it wrong. I'll only get notified when they get the right one. So I wouldn't give them remote access. I would make them tell me. So I would say, do you think this is the right one? And then they would say, no, or yes. If they say yes, I click it and I click, click, nothing happened. And I say, do you think this is the first picture in this story? And they say, yes, I click it and boom, it goes into the number 1 spot. So then I'm going to do the same thing for the next 7 pictures. So you click, I'm going to click on the 2, and now I can see this is my story in order. Or no, this is my choices, but they took out the second one because I've already chosen it. So it's going to eliminate me down to the end. So now they look and they decide what do they think is second in the story. If first the kids were throwing ball, what is next? You know, well, it's, you know, I keep looking, and I'm going to go with this one. Oh, great job for me. So they go through all of this. I'm going to find the third one. Okay, so the kid hit the ball. Is it this one? Click. No, it's not that one. And then I mark my data. So I just keep clicking, click, and then we get it. So they keep filling it in. I'm not going to do the whole story, but it just auto clicks its way right through all the pages until you get the whole story filled in. Then you have them tell the story orally. And then there are also some questions that go with the other download as well. I mean, it's just so cool. And they have about 5 or 6 of them that are really nice tools to use if you have someone who's fully virtual or someone in person. The Amazing Kids picture scenes, if the links are active for you, I'm not going to click on it, but it's like 90 or 100 picture scenes of just very busy, lots of things going on in there. Not good for all students, but very good for many of your students that you're doing an evaluation for. Getting a language sample, saying what things are, practicing describing, getting a lot of that information. And then the last 2 that I'm going to just highlight for you before I head into the question period is Cubed. Cubed is a free download. I'll click it so you can see on my screen if you don't want to click away. It's a measure for narrative language that's sort of affiliated with the story grammar marker. There's a download to it that will allow you to download some stimulus pictures, some stimulus questions, some sample narratives that they then retell, and then some normative data to go along with it. There is a reading measure as well. I don't often encourage anyone to use that reading measure because it's not particularly what I feel is our scope of practice, but the narrative language measure absolutely is. And then for those of you who had to learn to use SALT, the language analysis tool, Sugar is a revised analysis tool. It's right here, sampling utterances and grammatical analysis revised, Sugar. And it is also totally free and does a really nice job. You enter your students' data. So you'll take the language sample and then you'll enter like the number of words and some of the errors, and then it does some analyzing for you and puts out some results, but all also free. All right, let me see. I can't stress this enough, so I put it again at the end, but network. Don't discount how much that relationships with your colleagues gets you the information that you need. And keep communicating with everybody else. All right. Oh, use the Google tools. That's it. I think there's some presentations about this too. But between the Google tools and fillable PDFs, I think that's another easy way for us to network and communicate and get information to and from other folks. I just want a little shout out to the Patan Padlet because there's just so many valuable resources on that Padlet as well. All right, that brings me to the end. So I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to turn it back over to Elizabeth and see if there's any questions from